And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our special guest author joining us from Miami is Dr. Stephen A. Christy, author of Speaking for the Unborn, 30-Second Pro-Life Rebuttals to Pro-Choice Arguments, published by our friends at Emmaus Road Publishing, naturally available and proudly available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com for all things Catholic. Welcome, Dr. Christy, to EWTN's Bookmark. Good to have you.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Now, is this your first book? You're a lawyer, you're a doctor, and now you're an author. How'd you become an author?
This is my debut book. I have written a medical book, but that's not quite very important. This was my first real venture into publishing. Mm-hmm. I guess why I wrote the book, there's a pithy answer. Mm-hmm. There are 62 million reasons why I wrote the book. 62 million abortions since Roe in 1973. That's combined populations of California and New York. So if what's being aborted isn't alive, it's not human, then it doesn't matter. But if what's been aborted is alive and human, then we've aborted 62 million children, and that's why I wrote the book. I think the other reason I would say I wrote the book is because I really believe the pro-life cause is a winning one, and we have to be able to articulate our very powerful and persuasive reasons to anyone who asks. And like many people listening and watching today, we've all heard these wonderful arguments, rebuttals to pro-choice arguments. I thought it was time to collect them, to edit them, to modify them, and put them together in a user-friendly format that you could actually use in real-life discussions. And that's what this book was about.
Now, clearly, your last name, Christy, obviously you grew up in an incredible Catholic family. You've probably been pro-life your whole life. And now we have to listen to a man write a book about it. Tell us why my impression's incorrect.
Your impression obviously is incorrect. So I grew up in a very secular, progressive household. I went to a very pricey, secular, progressive high school where it was understood that educated, sophisticated, and thinking people were obviously pro-choice. We didn't know why they were pro-choice, but it was so obvious we didn't even bother asking. And conversely, pro-lifers were uneducated, unthinking, and probably intolerant Jesus freaks. And I went to law school. I was still pro-choice and atheist. When I went to medical school, I was still pro-choice and atheist. And if you'd asked me why I was pro-choice, even in the beginning of medical school, I wouldn't have been able to tell you. I might have thrown out a cliche, the my body, my choice, or I'd call you a misogynist, but I couldn't really explain my position. And what changed me, I guess, in a word, I would say is the truth. I like to remind, Shakespeare says, the truth will out. And in medical school, we study the facts about science and embryology, and more critically, you hold in your hands embryos and fetuses. Mm-hmm. And we learn there's a definition of life. It's not a political issue. It's not a philosophical issue. It's not a religious issue. The definition of what is alive is a scientific question that science has fully answered. Mm-hmm. And it's in every embryology book and every biology book that's studied at every medical school throughout this country. And that inevitably changes you.
But why doesn't, if it changed you from where you were coming from, why doesn't it change every other medical student?
It's interesting. There was a precise moment for me when it changed me, and maybe this will help illuminate this question. So one evening I was in the anatomy lab, and there's this anteroom off to the side that nobody goes into, covered in dust, and in the corner was a cabinet sort of turned against the wall. And I walked in there one evening, and I looked in the cabinet, and on shelves were jars of embryos and fetuses in formaldehyde. And I began staring at them, and I became horrified at how irreverently these babies were being treated. They were left and discarded. Probably hadn't been looked at in years and years and years. So the next day I found our embryology professor, and I told her, I confessed to her, I said, I'm really struggling. I found these embryos and fetuses, these babies on the shelf. It seems very irreverent to me. And she looked at me and grew agitated and angry. And she said to me, those are not babies. Those are embryos and fetuses. They were never alive. Never, never, never. Mm-hmm. And I thought of Hamlet and Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. The lady doth protest too much. Right. And I looked at her in the eyes. She looked at me. We froze. And the truth became evident to me. At that moment, I knew what I was looking at. And she knew the truth, too, which is interesting. So the question is, why didn't she acknowledge it? It comes down to a theory I have about those three monkeys, the see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. If to deny the truth is very difficult, the truth about the reality of the unborn. But if you can, for a generation or two, if you're able to close your eyes and close your ears and never speak the truth, you can lose sight of the truth entirely. Right. And I think that's what happens to a lot of people.
Yes, to carry Shakespeare for, maybe she's like Lady Macbeth, just a certain amount of guilt on her hands, so to speak, that she doesn't want to
Absolutely.
deal with. Now, you talk about
Absolutely.
the bulk of the arguments and rebuttals included here, as you indicated earlier, not original with me. I've tried to present the strongest, most persuasive rebuttals possible. Now, you put them into bite-sized 30 seconds, but you many times have multiple versions or several versions to questions. Let me ask you, are there any popular arguments that are out there that you looked at and said, this really doesn't work?
Well, interestingly, I'm a devout Catholic, which is a whole nother story. But one thing I've learned when debating in the real world with real pro-choice people, I avoid all religious arguments. Now, my wife argues with me a little bit about this, but I've learned that the people you're debating with almost always are secular progressive atheists. And we have so many wonderful arguments to make based on science, based on the law, based on social justice, based on morality, based on the visible evidence. And if you've made 9 arguments in a discussion during a debate, and they're non-religious arguments, powerful arguments you've made, and then you say the word God or sanctity of life or the Bible, you'll see the face of the person you're speaking with change, and you can read their mind. And their mind is saying something like this. They're saying, and I've had this experience, they're saying, Steve, I didn't realize you're one of those freaks. And then every non-religious argument I made has disappeared. So I've read many, many wonderful religious arguments against abortion. And when debating a religious person, they're wonderful arguments. But I've learned I don't go with those arguments. I avoid them whenever possible. I feel it's handing a club to your opponents with which to beat you over the head.
Well, that sounds perfectly logical. Let me ask you, when you're talking to, let's say, other people who are Catholic or Christian or religious in some way, and they say, well, Steve, I don't agree with abortion. I wouldn't have an abortion. But, I'm pro-choice. I don't want to impose. These are some of the arguments you deal with in the book. Do you use religion in that argument if you're dealing with somebody who is religious, or do you stay away from that anyway?
I generally stay away. I feel our arguments are so strong otherwise that I don't feel there's a need to go there. If I see the opening for it and I know they're very faithful, I'll use it. But in terms of imposing, the arguments we have against people who say, I don't want to impose my views, the arguments are so strong. If we tell people that every member of society imposes their morality on everybody else every single day, on critical moral issues like rape and murder and theft, we not only impose our morality on people, but if they commit those crimes, we'll throw them in jail. And that's imposing their morality, every single day. That's what we do. And for somebody to say, I'm personally pro-life, but who am I to impose my views on other people? I always pull up the classic argument. I say, well, can you imagine me saying I'm personally anti-slavery? But if you want to slave her too, that's your business. Who am I to impose my views? And that's obviously nonsense. On critical moral issues, we have a duty to impose our moral views on otherwise. And if we don't, it is actually immoral.
And in some cases, the secular society is really imposing their morality, aren't they?
Absolutely. They're imposing their morality. They just don't want to call it imposing. Right. It's not imposing on their side if they dismiss us as misogynists or religious Jesus freaks. Right. Then they sort of dismiss us and they don't have to make arguments for us.
Right. Now, in the table of contents, you got a forward, you talk about strategy, but you also break it down as category 1 through basically 8. And it seemed like they sort of lined up in the amount of weeks of the child growing in the mother. Is that a fair analysis of what you put together, and why'd you do that?
I actually... You're actually right. There is a lot of correlation, but I organized them just by category as to what things you could use multiple rebuttals for the same types of arguments. I thought by categorizing the arguments that they were making, we could categorize and organize our rebuttals. So a lot of them fall into the not alive, or it's not a person, or it's not a human. The body might, it's a clump of cells argument, for instance. Or it's a potential human. The other categories, woman's autonomy, the my body, my choice argument. And so I found if you clustered your arguments and rebuttals together, you could recall them. That's why, as you mentioned before, I offer multiple rebuttals from multiple arguments, because some might feel more comfortable to you. So you can make these your own. So you take these rebuttals. You don't have to memorize them word for word, but you sort of memorize them as bullet points. So you can pull them up and use them in a way that you feel comfortable using them.
In the beginning of the book, you talk about strategy. The pro-choice movement relies on denying the truth about abortion through denial, manipulation, and falsehoods. You go on to say, inevitably, their arguments boil down to a single falsehood. Sex is liberating and should be without consequence.
Yeah, that ultimately is the final argument I make. The argument about whether it's alive or whether it's human or whether it's a person, those are arguments that the pro-choice movement lost years and years ago. Their ultimate argument is that sex is liberating and must be protected at all costs, which is really a broken human anthropology. When we think that our personal sovereignty is the most important thing in the world, then anything that gets in the way of that sovereignty must be destroyed, and even if it means our own children. And that's where they've led. So in the book, as you talked about, we mentioned strategy. The book, before we ever get to the arguments, we talk about where we speak, we talk about how we speak, and then we get to what we speak, the words we speak. And for the where, I think it's important to stress, we see the Ben Shapiro's of the world out in stadiums all day long, and they're confronting masses of crowds who are fighting with them, and that's wonderful and noble. That's not what I can do, but we all have an obligation in the course of our ordinary lives to speak with the people that are around us. Right. So it's our family members, it's our friends, it's our coworkers. And that's the role we have. That's the where we speak. And the how we speak is we always speak charitably. We always speak kindly, with compassion. These are arguments that people tend to get hot under the collar, and we just can't do that. Our job is to win hearts, and not necessarily always winning arguments.
Right.
And a lot of people say
that.
to me,
right.
A lot of people say, what does that actually mean, Steve? Winning hearts. What's that mean? And for me, I've learned when I'm having a conversation with somebody. Now, my parents are pro-choice. My childhood friends are pro-choice. So when I'm speaking with somebody, especially a stranger, I think, how would I speak if these were my parents? Or how would I speak if these were my closest friends that I've grown up with? And the words I always hope to hear are somebody say to me, Steve, that's interesting. I never really thought about it that way before. And to me, that's the sound of the heart opening up to the truth.
Right.
And that's the key.
Right. And you also point out the fact that when you're talking, that 25% of the women who you might be speaking with probably already had an abortion. Or certainly if they didn't have one, they were probably involved in someone having one or being involved with it in some fashion. You also talk about, which is fully what this book focuses on, being clear but simple but brief. Why?
Well, I think it's been studied. The attention span of the average person is less than 1 minute during a discussion. Plus, you want to give something to leave them with and to hang on to. So some people say do everything in steps of 3. Give them 3 points. I've learned a simple, clear argument sticks with them, especially when it's delivered respectfully. And with an open mind. I try to agree with people as much as I can when we're having these debates. If there's a small point they make that I can agree with, I make a real point of saying I agree with you on that, or that's a great point. However, there's one addition I would like to make to that. So I've learned you win hearts by agreeing with people and treating them with respect and not poking them in the eye. And I think it's critically important to remember that 25% of the women we're speaking with have had an abortion. And it's just not the secular other world out there. These are our friends, our parents, our coworkers, our family members. And these women suffer greatly. They have guilt, and we need to treat them with compassion. Absolutely.
Right, and many over the years obviously were misled and were not presented with the actual truth over the years, and so we have to realize that and not treat as if somehow, well, you should have known better. You said, why am I pro-life in 30 seconds? This manual includes my 30-second summary of why I'm pro-life, and you recommend that not only you understand that, but that you memorize. You would talk about how you went about memorizing it.
Well, the opportunity to defend the pro-life position, I've learned, is common, and it's usually unexpected. So you might get one chance to make your shot, and you have to make it count. So often I learned early in this process that pro-choice people can't articulate their views. They throw out a cliche, they throw out a personal attack, but they can't articulate their views. But depressingly, the pro-life cause, most of us can't articulate our views either. So I learned we need to stop and memorize, for ourselves and understand why we're pro-life. So for me, I have a 30-second summary that I've memorized. I usually can remember most of it. So when the opportunity arises, I can pump it out, and it gives people real food for thought. And I'm happy to give you mine. It's in the book. It's on a website, speakingfortheunborn.org. And usually it leaves people stunned in silence, unable to rebut. What I say is my summary is I say I'm pro-life because I'm pro-science. There's overwhelming scientific consensus that life begins at conception. And I'm pro-life because social justice begins in the womb, because every living human being is entitled to the most fundamental right, that being life itself. And I'm pro-life because I'm pro-woman. Abortion degrades women, treating their fertility as a defect and enabling men to use and abuse them and then abandon them. Abortion never empowers women, just the men that wish to exploit them. And I'm pro-life because I'm against violence, and I go into that. I go into the visible evidence and objective morality. And then I say, that's why I'm pro-life. And then I ask, why aren't you? And I never get a response. I never get a response. So it's good to have that 30-second summary.
Of the ones that you point out, I would have thought today, one of the ones that would probably work quite well would be the whole idea of social justice begins in the womb.
Absolutely, that's the language of today. Equality, and it's good language today. It's abused and misused, that language today. But whether we get into social causes of Black Lives Matter, whether you agree with the way that the movement is used is not the point for me. The point is there injustice in the world that needs to be righted? Absolutely. Is there bigotry and racism in the world? Absolutely. And I use those good intentions and those good causes for our movement as well. So I'm not manipulating, but social justice is a very important issue on multiple fronts, and it absolutely is a cause now for the unborn.
Early on, pro-choice arguments 4 and 5, but this was interesting in your response. It says it's just a potential human being. You say there's simply no such thing as a potential human. It's unscientific and it's a made-up term. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, there is no scientific potential human being. Being human is not a matter of degrees. You're either human or you are not. When we talk about an embryo or a fetus, those are not non-humans. Those are just stages in the development of human beings, just as a newborn is and an adolescent is and a young adult is and an elderly is. These are stages in our development. They're not stages in intrinsic value or intrinsic worth, and they're not stages of we're not going from non-humans to humans. You're either human or you're not.
Right. You also even talk about here the idea of personhood being a manufactured term.
Sure. Personhood, if you look in history, it's only used as a weapon. So blacks weren't persons when we wanted to subjugate them. Women weren't persons when we wanted to subjugate them. And now we see the same thing with the unborn. To be a person is to be a human being, which, by the way, if you go to any household dictionary, it's not a complex metaphysical problem. Go to Merriam-Webster and look what's the definition of person. It is a human being. And any other definition is arbitrary. The only objective definition of a person and it is a human, unless we're ready to call people in comas non-persons and non-humans. Are we willing to call Alzheimer's patients non-persons and non-humans? And I don't think we want to go there.
Right. One of the classic arguments, number 7, the embryo is, it's a woman's body. I can decide what it is. You say the embryo is in no way a part of the mother's body. Science clearly defines the body part as a structure that shares the same genetic code as the rest of the body.
Right. So the appendix is a part of the body, has the same genetic code, and it doesn't control its own development. That's the key term. So an embryo and a fetus obviously have their own genetic code. In fact, half the time it has an opposite sex of the mother who's carrying the baby, and it has the genetic information to control its own development. So by definition, it's not a body part. And what I think all these arguments point out is that the pro-life cause depends on science, facts, and the truth, which is so refreshing, and it really gets us motivated to be a part of this cause. The pro-choice movement just relies on cliches. It just relies on ad hominem personal attacks. And it's exciting to be on the side of truth, facts, and science. It really is.
What's interesting, number 10, an abortion should be permitted until the fetus can feel pain. Interesting. The other one is the idea that an embryo or fetus is unaware of its own destruction, so it doesn't matter. I never heard that one.
Yeah, so we'll talk about things about whether something is sentient or not. And if it's not aware of we hear this all the time in real life conversations and when we read about these things, that the fetus and embryo is unaware of its own destruction, so it doesn't matter. But being aware is not the issue. If a woman, I always point out, a woman drunk at a fraternity party who's molested by 3 men may not be aware of it. But awareness is not a requirement for an evil and a harm to have been done to that woman, just like an evil and a harm is being done during an abortion to the fetus and embryos.
Number 16, even if the unborn are living human beings, they have fewer rights than the mother. And you kind of hear that, the idea that we got past the idea, okay, maybe it's a baby, but the mother has more rights than the child does. Right,
and there we just have to look at the rights. And this is where I start to find parts of agreement. So should a woman have autonomy of her own body? Absolutely, for the most part. Just like a man should have autonomy over his own body. Absolutely, for the most part. But we have to look at competing rights. When we talk about justice, it's each person getting their due. So we know the rights of the mother should have we should do everything possible for preserving her bodily integrity and autonomy. But we have to look at the rights of the child as well. So the right of the mother is the right to a lifestyle free of burden, which is an important one, but it's not an absolute one. The right of the baby is the right to life itself to not be killed. So we're talking about lifestyle versus life. And life has to trump lifestyle every time. So does a woman have rights? Absolutely. I have a very strong, educated, powerful, successful wife who should have every right that I have, and probably more. She's more capable than I am. And I have 5 children, 2 very strong daughters who I want to have bodily integrity and tremendous capability and tremendous rights. But like all of our rights in our life, they're all mitigated by where they infringe on somebody else. And as we say, the right to swing your fist ends just before it touches my nose.
What about, in 27 through 30, you deal with I can't afford a baby right now, it's going to devastate my career, I'm going to have to quit school, now would be harmful even to my other children?
So these are the burden arguments. And again, these are heartstring arguments. And when a woman says, I don't know what's going to happen to me in life, we obviously sympathize and our hearts go out to this woman. The question is it okay to dismember a living baby alive because a woman says it's inconvenient for her at that time in life? The response to a woman who says this is a terrible inconvenience is to rush to the woman's aid and help her in her time of need. We don't eliminate the problem by killing. Solutions based on killing living human beings are never okay. So one thing the pro-life movement has to remember is that abortion isn't a sign that women are free, but a sign they're desperate. So one of the criticisms that we get in the pro-life movement, which is somewhat valid, is that sometimes we focus too much on the fetus and embryo and not enough on the mother. And it's not an either-or phenomenon. We must be rushing to the aid of women.
Right, and I think it's fair to say that the pro-life movement has come a long way in that area, and so a lot of those arguments in the past are not as true today as they might have been when this first happened in the 70s. Pro-choice argument 46, why should only men be able to engage in sex without life-altering consequences? And you make the point the feminist movement wasn't wrong when it said that men were acting like pigs. They were wrong, though, in saying that the solution to this sad fact is for women to also act like pigs, which is exactly, we've defined deviancy down.
Absolutely. Women are aspiring to the worst characteristics in men. And that's a very bad sign. That's a very bad sign, and we're seeing that in the culture we have right now, that women think their freedom is sex without consequences. And we've learned that's enslavement for them, and it's destruction for women, because abortion degrades you can't have free sex without abortion. And abortion degrades everything it touches. It degrades the mother. It degrades the father. It degrades the doctor. It degrades the nurse that's assisting in the procedure, and to the custodian who's going to pick up the remains in the plastic bag of the day. Abortion degrades everything it touches.
Pro-choice argument 49, better to be aborted than end up in an unhappy foster care system of many states. And you actually have a meme-like image on the side that says, a close one, this baby was almost born into poverty, but his mother killed him in the nick of time. Right,
that's Babylon Bee. So these are the arguments that God forbid the child end up in foster care. It's better to dismember and kill the child. And what these people are saying, it's better to eliminate the sufferer than the suffering. So is it true that a lot of our foster care systems need radical and massive improvement? You bet it's true. Is the answer killing babies so they don't go in the foster system? Absolutely not. We need to focus our energies in improving the foster system, improving and streamlining the adoption systems. So we need to, and the pro-life movement needs to do this as well. We need to rush to the aid of these women, rush to the aid of foster care, rush to the aid of crisis pregnancy centers, et cetera. We need to put our money where our mouth is. And we do that, by the way, but we need to step up to that and bring it to the next level.
Right, it doesn't get acknowledged all the time in the media because it doesn't support their argument. Number 50, talking about dealing with handicapped or deformed children. We don't want to bring them into the world like Iceland was doing earlier. So you're making an argument, you say, for eugenics, improving the species and society by eliminating undesirable traits. Well, they certainly could, because that's how Planned Parenthood started, right?
Absolutely. Margaret Sanger was a big advocate. She was a proud racist, a proud eugenicist, who didn't like what she called the indiscriminate breeding of minorities, whom she considered human weeds. So she planned these Planned Parenthood centers. They put them in minority neighborhoods, and right now, for instance, 80% of their Planned Parenthood centers are in minority neighborhoods. And abortion, as a result, abortion is the #1 killer of Black lives, for example, in America, more than heart disease, more than diabetes, more than violence combined.
Right.
And one thing we know is when people argue for aborting a child with a disability, they're arguing for their own convenience. They're not arguing to help a child. The majority of handicapped people lived happy lives. And you can go back even to John Merrick, the Elephant Man, who says, I'm glad I'm alive because I'm loved. And you know who most dislikes to hear these things? The parents of disabled children, to think that people are telling their children's lives and their lives would be better if they didn't have them. I think it's a horrific thing to do. And eugenics puts you in the company of groups in our past world history that you don't want to be associated with.
Like the Nazis, life not worthy of life. Exactly.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, and she was popular over there. With that, we're going to have to leave it. Thank you so much, Dr. Stephen A. Christy. The book, Speaking for the Unborn, 30-second pro-life rebuttals to pro-choice arguments. You should check this book out. Very illuminating. Available through our EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com, all things Catholic. I'm Doug Keck. Thank you for joining us right here on Bookmark. We shall see you next time.